Hey everyone, and welcome back to Secure Future Initiative Tech Tips, where we talk to Microsoft experts about applying learnings from SFI. I'm Michael Howard. I'm a senior director on the Microsoft Red team, and I'm joined by my co-host Sarah Young, who is a principal security advocate. And welcome back, Nick. We'd like to take a moment and just sort of reintroduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Sarah, for having me on today. My name is Nick Ryder. I'm a principal product manager. I work with the Identity Network and Access Product Group, focusing on customer experience. Happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about managed identities. I'm a huge fan of managed identities, and I'll let me explain why. And obviously I'll let you, go into more detail, but the reason why I'm such a fan of managed identities, and this is something we talk about a lot actually on the Azure Security podcast, is more and more products are moving to use managed identities, and there's a reason for that. Attackers are going after primarily one thing, and that is credentials. And if we can remove credentials from the environment, then there's nothing there for the attacker to compromise and then use to gain sort of foothold into the environment, then laterally produce, sort of spread themselves across the environment. So do you want to just explain briefly what managed identities are and human versus non-human managed identities?
Yeah. So managed identities are a feature that's in Microsoft Azure, right? And they provide resources within automatic managed identity within Entra ID, right? So it's actually managed inside the directories that Entra actually holds. This identity can be used to authenticate to any service that supports Entra ID authentication. And it doesn't need you managing credentials. So you mentioned credentials, right? As we know, threat actors, scan the web. They have crawlers that are basically doing discovery attacks by just trying to find resources that have credentials or secrets attached to them. And so managed identities come very handy for this kind of use case here, right? So there are two different types of managed identities. There are the human managed identities and the non-human managed identities. When we talk about the human managed identities, these are identities that are assigned to individuals. So there's a person that actually is assigned to this, and they're typically used for interactive logins, right? And they're managed by the users themselves. And you can attach this to those resources as well. When it comes to non-human managed identities, these identities really are assigned to applications. So if you think about what do bad actors try to do for the most part when they do cloud discovery attacks, they're looking for non-human identities or applications, services, or automated processes that actually have a secret associated with them, because that is the easiest way that they can get a foothold into someone's environment, right? So these non-human managed identities really help you with those non-interactive logins. So not necessarily having a human there to do those logins, and they're used and managed by the system itself.
Nick, the non-human one I wanted to dig into a little bit, because historically it was always really hard or maybe even impossible to give a non-human identity manager. You just had to use some kind of key or secret. So how has that evolved for folks who might not have looked at that for a long time?
Oh, yes. I mean, everyone thinks that whenever you have a resource or you have some kind of application or some kind of workload, you need to give it a secret to protect it, right? That notion or that approach has changed, because now in most of the major clouds, you can actually give a specific role-based access control to a specific resource, right? And this is across all the different clouds as well. So that approach has evolved, and that's the reason why we have non-human managed identities. And then within Azure specifically, they're called system managed identities.
I really want to stress just how important this is. If an attacker gets an environment, and like you say, there's a secret, so an application can talk to say a SQL database or a storage account or something. If the attacker can get that, then they now have access, right? I mean, it's really as simple as that. But if it's not there, then they can't. So let's give a real solid example. Let's say you got a virtual machine. I can give that virtual machine, as many other applications I can give identities too, but let's say I have this virtual machine, I can give it a managed identity. So when any code running inside that VM reaches out and touches some other resource, so for example, a storage account or an Azure SQL database, it's actually under the identity of that VM. And there's no credential there. It's all managed by Entra ID. It's not like a secret you've got persisted somewhere. So again, if the attacker gets in the environment, there's no credential there to steal. Is that a true statement?
That's very true, right? And that's the distinction, right? And that's why I wanted to also maybe bring back the two different versions of managed identities, right? The human, or we like to call the system assigned identities, are automatically created with and managed by Azure, and they're stored. Those credentials are stored within Entra ID. And you tie all that whole system assigned identities lifecycle to that Azure's resource. Meaning, when I create a VM, as you mentioned, Michael, whenever that VM dies, it dies with this managed identity that's being managed. So it's automatically deleted when that resource is deleted. Now, when we think about it for the user assigned identities, well, this is another type of managed identity that is created as a standalone within that Azure resource, and you can reuse those, right? And that can be assigned to multiple Azure resources because, depending on your use case, depending on what you're trying to do, you want to ensure that as you create a managed identity, even though it's going to be hosted within the Entra ID directory, that you can use it on multiple resources as you build and as you keep, doing things like infrastructure as code, or if you just want to use application services that require the use of, a user assigned identity, you can reuse that same managed identity. And then lastly, within that user assigned identity, you can manage it independently, of the lifecycle of the resource. Meaning, if the lifecycle dies, you can still hold on to that user assigned identity and use it for other resources.
So before we get onto a demo, let's just recap what we just talked about. So we have Entra identities, we can have human identities, and we can have, so let's call them application identities. Then under application identities, we can have user assigned identities, or we can have system assigned identities. And there's pros and cons of each, right? System identities are handled completely by Entra, and you can apply one-to-one resource. User assigned identities can be assigned to multiple resources, but there's more sort of administrative overhead that you must be involved with. Is that fair?
That's very fair. And yeah, we can talk about the pros and cons if you like. Just to, like you said, just to recap it a little bit, right? So for system identities, system assigned identities, let's be very clear with how they're called. As you know, our names change around here a lot of times. So with the system assigned identities, one of the pros are one, it simplifies identity management on it, right? Meaning it's automatically handled by Azure. There's no need for manual management of that credential ever. So that's one big pro. The cons are, well, it's limited to a single resource, right? So if you want to, keep using that system assigned identity, if it's not tied to that resource, you won't be able to use it. And so when that resource is deleted, that system assigned identity is also deleted with it. Now, when we talk about the user assigned identities, one of the pros are, well, it can be shared across multiple resources. So once I have access to that, I can use it for multiple resources. And then it provides that flexibility and that reusability of that managed identity. The cons are obviously requires like manual management. You could put it into a function, or you could put it into one of those Terraform scripts that you might have. But remember, we want to get away from having secrets and credentials. And just like managed identities, what you want to do as a con of a user assigned identity is, well, they're slightly more complex to set up and maintain, because you also have to tell the app service or the resource service to actually look out for that specific managed identity.
And just before we move on to the demo and you actually show us how to do this, Nick, what would you say, there might be folks who haven't tried to integrate an application with Microsoft identity things for a long time. Maybe the last time they looked at it was on premise. So and obviously things were very different back then. So what would you say if people maybe are worried they won't be able to integrate their application very well?
I'll say things have gotten so much better. I mean, I think I would always advise and suggest that, any IT pro or developers out there that need and want to maybe utilize some of the power of what Entra has been doing lately, just go into Entra, integrate your application or your app service with Entra, and see what you could do to protect, number one, your app, how to get yourself, strong credentials, and be able to do certain things using our policy enforcement point to manage that specific application. and here's the reason. Conditional access policies now give you ways to look at app risks. You can look at things that and even determine when a bad actor is trying to get access to your application. And you can see the integrated permissions that are going to those applications. So if you've not used, Entra to manage your apps, or as a developer, if you thought that, Microsoft is not doing anything in the spaces of applications and protecting applications and development, you will be very, very surprised when you go back to it, because it's way, way advanced and it's very, very good.
Cool. I think it's about time you show us how to do it.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we're here in the Azure portal. So I'm just here in my demo tenant, and we're just going to go directly. You can go directly to the middle part and search for managed identity, and you're going to click on it. I have a bunch of them, as you can see. It's actually very good to have lots of managed identities that you use. And what I'm going to walk us through is going to be the user assigned identity. Here's why, right? We want to be able to create this resource, give it the right amount of permission so that you can reuse it for a specific use case here, right? And with the system assigned one, that's tied to a resource. So if I wanted to build like a storage account and have a managed identity with it, then we will be able to do it. So let me find my resource group that I'm going to create this in really quick. Okay, and I'm going to name it as SFI Tech Tips. Okay, let me hit create. And just like that, you see, I just created the user assigned managed identity. It takes a couple of seconds for it to come up. Okay, let's go to the resource. It looks like it's done. Okay, so now you can see very clearly I have a, this tech tips, and I have this user assigned managed identity created. Now, before we go and show how to actually use this, I wanted to show a very interesting use case. So Sarah, you did say, hey, what are some developers who've not ever used Entra and developed some of their app services? One of the very, very cool functionalities that we do have here is, well, it's not just Entra ID, right? If you have an identity from an external OpenID Connect provider, doesn't matter where they come from, right? To get those tokens. Now, with this managed identity that I created, I can easily add it to whatever scenarios I want. So if I want to do things in GitHub and I want to do things in Kubernetes, accessing Azure resources, or if I just want to just attach this to an external OpenID Connect provider, I can actually do that with a click of a button, as you see very clearly here. So I'm not going to go into the details of it, but these are some of the improvements that you could see what you could do with the managed identity within Azure and Entra today, right? It's very cool. Okay.
Nice.
All right. So just some housekeeping things. So once you create this, most organizations, best practice, you want to tag it so you always know what it is. As you can see, it has my demo name, when it was created. I have some automation in the background. This is just standard practice. You want to make sure you tag it, you know who did what, and it's very easy for you to track. Good. Now, after that's done, we can now go to all app services, right? So here I can pick any type of application I want that I want to create, whether it's something new I want to create or an actual application that I would like. And in this case, I'm going to pick this Adatum assistant here, right? This is an AI app that I created, and this is the front end of that web application. And this web app needs a managed identity. As you could see here, I have to, when you go to the application itself, before you get there, you got to go to settings. Let me slow down so I show what all of these things look like. You go to settings of the application service. So, and then when you go there, there's a tab called identity. And then when you go to identity, you have two specific blocks. You have the system assigned managed identity, as you can see very clearly right here, that comes with it. So you can see that this app already has a system assigned identity to it, because I just flipped this switch to on, and it gets a system managed managed identity that's associated with it. So if I actually kill this application, guess what goes away with it? The system assigned identity goes away with it. However, I can also do the user assigned managed identity by simply going to the user assigned and hitting the plus sign with it. and searching for SFI tech tips. All right, as you can see, with just one click, I just added a user-assigned managed identity. Again, let's go back to why this is so cool, why this is so easy, and why this is so important. When a bad actor compromises my Datum Assistant app service, right? This is the front end of an AI app. Well, guess what? They won't have any secrets to steal from, because I actually assigned it a specific managed identity. So that's the first thing I want to do. Second thing I want to do is you'll have to go back into the app's code and then tell the app to look for this user assigned managed identity. That's a little bit deeper, but I mean, as most developers know, setting authentication on an app is just a few lines of code that you can do. But I just wanted to mainly show within the web app service, as simple as it is, you can go to identity portion within the settings and flip the system assigned on, and you get a system assigned identity, which is the managed identity that you can use and let it be managed by the system, or you can do it from a user standpoint and get a user assigned managed identity.
Yeah. Now, Nick, what about the permissions on that identity as well? Because, of course, we always talk about the principle of least privilege. People should only have the absolute minimum that they need. So when you create a managed identity, what does it get as default? Does it get anything or everything? What happens there?
That is a great question. And I intentionally didn't do that because it's important to know that even though I actually added this added this managed identity to this resource, the resource doesn't even know to look at it because it doesn't have any permissions to read the managed identity, right? So that's very important, because then I can go to that managed identity, SFI tech tips. And if I go to the access controls, right? So here we're focused specifically on the permissions, or using role-based access controls, right? I always like to do this talk and say, what is a role? A role is a collection of permissions, right? And those permissions are what gives a resource access to do specific actions and tasks on a specific resource. So, when you check the role assignments, you could see what kind of roles does this app have? Well, there's a lot of built-in roles here that I have access to, but this app itself does not have any specific access, right? And so I can say, well, because we want to do least privilege, I'm going to give this app reader access to this app, so that when it needs to do authentication for the app using our managed identity, it actually knows to actually read to say, yep, you have access to do these things, right? And so I can add the reader role.
And just so we're clear there, you're adding the permission to the identity rather than the application, right?
I am adding the permission to the managed identity itself. Yes.
And then the managed identity is is linked to the application, but they actually are two separate entities, right?
Yes. Because remember, this IAM or access control that I'm trying to show here is just saying the managed identity and the RBAC roles within Azure need to come together, because without it, the app does not know. This managed identity has no way of talking to this Datum Assistance app, right? It needs to have reader access to be able to read this managed identity that I have on this specific managed identity for this app. And that's why I need to give it reader, so that it can view the resources that are on this resource group that I'm actually trying to manage.
So Nick, just quickly, because I know this is a huge topic that we don't have time for, but when we've made a managed identity, we do need to add a permission to it so it actually works. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean, that is the reason why, I thought that no one was going to catch me, but I'm glad that you guys are on it, right? Because you can see very clearly, right? When I go back to this particular managed identity, there is a way to give access control to it and give it the right amount of permissions that it actually needs, right? Because in order for this managed identity to see my app and be able to use that managed identity within the app, you definitely need to give it at least privilege permission.
Yes, and that's good to remember that it should be the least privilege that they need to be able to do whatever that application is doing, right? We don't just give everyone God mode or global admin because it's easy.
Yeah, and don't
Correct.
forget, yeah, by default, this account has no access to anything whatsoever until you do that. That's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's correct, right? And so, yeah, it's very, very important to remember that whenever a resource is created within Azure, they have no permissions. And so giving it the least privileged permissions by adding what you need according to whatever use case you have within your organization will ensure that that resource is, secure by default.
Nice. Michael, you got any more questions for Nick on managed identity?
I have no questions. I really don't want to stress just how important they are, though. Again, I'm on the red team, so we see credentials, and we don't want to see credentials, right? Because the moment we can get credentials, we can start traversing through the environment. So, removing credentials is so critically important, and managed identities are the, prime way of doing that. So yeah, really, everyone should be looking into managed identities if they're not already doing so.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been another great conversation with you about identity-related things. And for those of you tuning in, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on another episode of Secure Future Initiative Tech Tips.